Americans are going to need a visa to visit Europe. That's what the media is saying, calling the days of spontaneous trips to Spain or France a thing of the past. Today, I'm going to tell you the truth that the media is not telling you about this alleged need for Americans to get visas in Europe. Here's the truth. What the media is telling you about this new visa requirement in Europe is much ado about nothing. Now, I think there are some implications that you should be aware of, but the idea that it's going to become difficult to travel to Europe is being overblown. And it just shows that having a U.S. passport, and this can apply to Canadians or Australians, I'm sure the news is somewhat the same there, has given people a certain isolation about what actually happens when traveling the world. So here's what's happening with this new visa, as they're calling it in Europe. Europe is rolling out an electronic travel authorization called ETIAS, E-T-I-A-S. It's been delayed for a number of years. They're saying it's going to be released in January 2024. Nobody believes that, but likely sometime in 2024, people who are not citizens of European Union countries will need to obtain this electronic travel authorization to visit countries in the Schengen area. So the Schengen area is a little bit different than the European Union. For example, Ireland is in the EU, but not in the Schengen area. Norway is not in the EU, but is in the Schengen area. So the Schengen area is borderless Europe. You fly to Spain, you take a train, take a car to France, you can travel between those countries. And as an American, Canadian, Australian, anybody who can visit Europe, Georgian, Mexican, what have you, 90 days out of 180 days. What a lot of people don't even understand from the United States is you cannot just go to Europe and live. Contrary to what television shows tell you, I'm moving to France. How? Do you have a residence permit? If you want to spend more than 90 days in the totality of Europe's Schengen area, you need to have a residence permit. And we help people do that at Nomad Capitalist. There's self-sufficient residence permits. There's golden visas that lead to citizenship. There's digital nomad visas. There's lots of different ways that you can stay in various European countries. But what Europe is now saying is they're going to implement the same policy that the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and even countries like South Korea have, which is before you come, you need to answer some questions online. That's what this ETIAS is. It's not really a visa. It's an electronic travel authorization. And so we have to get the terms correct. If you're an American, for example, and you go to Turkey, you need to get an e-visa. The e-visa has like 3 questions. It costs a few bucks. It's largely, I think, just a chance to, verify people through the system and collect some revenue. And that's actually easier than what, let's say, a British citizen has to go through filling out the United States version of this electronic travel authorization called ESTA, where they ask you a lot of questions. The United States is now disallowing anyone who's visited even Cuba since 2021. And they went back to the early 2010s, and if you visited Iran or other, countries they don't like, you can't come. So if you're British, if you're German, and you're one of the millions of Europeans who've been to Cuba in the last couple of years, you now have to go to the U.S. Embassy in most cases and get a visa. You cannot just show up in the United States, even though your passport has visa-free access to the United States, ostensibly, because the United States, after 9/11, created this ESTA system. Canada, Australia, New Zealand followed, where, again, you're going online before you're allowed to fly, and you have to get the all-clear through this electronic travel authorization. I did it going to Australia a number of years ago. It's not a difficult process, but I'm going to tell you the one reason you might need to be concerned. So Europe is rolling this out. What you can call this is legacy brand countries thinking no matter how many barriers we can put up to visiting our country, people will still put up with it, right? So the U.S. started it under the guise of security, as is everything's under the guise of security, right? People will do it, we'll collect 14 bucks every time, whatever. And yet some of those became harder than getting actual e-visas. Like I got an e-visa to go to Vietnam recently. Not that hard at all. How it's going to work is, before you want to go to Europe, you'll go on the ETIAS website, you'll answer some questions about where you work and your passport details and relatively basic stuff. They're going to run you through these systems. I think for, as they're saying, 99% of people or more, you're going to get an answer in 5 minutes when you enter your biographical information. You tell them where you work, you tell them where you're going to go. It's relatively straightforward. You're going to pay €7 or about $8, and they're going to give you an answer right away. You print it out, you show it at the airport, you can get out of the flight. That's how it works in Australia. That's how it works in the US. It's not a huge deal. So when the New York Post, for example, says long gone are the days of spontaneous holidays overseas, this is something you're going to get once every 3 years, and then you're done. Various countries, I think they're valid for 2 years in some, 3 years in other. This is not something you necessarily have to get every single time you go. Now, if your passport expires before that 3 years is up, you'll need to get a new one for the new passport. I have long suggested not only should you be filling your passport up before most passports in most countries are good for 10 years. You should be filling that passport up to where you need to replace it. But you never want to wait until your passport is getting too close to expiration, because look at how people got stuck during COVID, for example, when Western countries couldn't manage to get a passport to you in less than a year in some cases. I was getting passports issued the same day in one or two countries where I was a citizen, but some of the US and Canada, they really dragged it out. That not only meant you couldn't travel, it meant you couldn't do real estate deals overseas. It means you couldn't open bank accounts. Your identity on the global stage was shut down because you didn't have an up-to-date passport. So you want to keep your passport up to date at all times, and if you keep more than 3 years of validity, you'll only need to get one ETIAS permission in Europe every 3 years. So overall, this is not the big issue that the media is pointing it out. What I think a lot of Americans and other Westerners don't understand is, yes, you have very good visa-free travel. No denying that. U.S. passport is what we would call a Tier A passport. And yet, not everyone gets to travel visa-free. What I believe is you're seeing greater nationalism, you're seeing greater calls for security, and some of this is just legacy brand countries, as we call them, saying, hey, you did it to us, we're going to do it to you. That's one of the articles I read. Says Europe is saying, we're filling out this form to go to the U.S. for a long time. Why don't we have any form of our own? This is ridiculous. And they're seeing how their own citizens are being discriminated against. Germany, Spain, other European countries, they didn't have a beef with Cuba. Obama did try and say, hey, let's be a little bit closer with Cuba. Trump administration wanted to go back to the policy. So now Europeans they've just gone to Cuba. It's a normal vacation for them. It's like you going to Cancun. They're saying, this is unfair. Let's have our own system. And here's what could happen. You might see in the future some questions that get added to screen some people from a country like the United States out. I don't believe that they're going to necessarily, target people based on their nationality. But certainly if you have a criminal record, that could be an issue. Most people with a criminal record, or many people with a criminal record, have a hard time visiting the United States or Canada. So there could be something like that. If you've traveled to certain places, that could be an issue. So there's potential with any of these systems to add more and more questions. The U.S. really has a pretty rigorous system for anyone to fill out. If you've done stuff they don't like, you're not getting it. And you can say, hey, that's great, but what's good for the goose is good for the gander. What I like about some of the up-and-coming countries that we talk about is they realize, number one, I don't know that they have the energy to do this, the desire to do this, and I think they also realize we don't want to put up more impediments to people coming to our country. I like that attitude. Now, am I not going to go to Europe because of ETIAS? No, I will go. I do think it's a good opportunity if you want to have, access to Europe on an ongoing basis. Let's say you want a backup place to live and you're not ready for some of the up-and-coming places yet. And you say, hey, I'm American, I'm Canadian, I'm Australian. Europe seems comfortable for me. Let's make that the backup. Let's make that the place where we're going to work towards citizenship for the family. Okay, this is now a reminder that they can impose barriers on you. And so having a residence permit or even getting citizenship, let's say through your family tree, if you have an ancestor from a European country, or if you can spend $1 million and get Malta citizenship, you can do that in 15 to 18 months. This is a reminder, hey, maybe you want to give yourself a higher level of access, because for the first time ever, you're seeing you can't just show up whenever you want without doing anything first. Quite frankly, I think you'll still be able to book a flight to Europe a couple days after you go through this thing, because again, most people are going to get an answer in a matter of minutes. Some people might take a day. A small percentage it'll take up to a couple weeks. So spontaneity is not really going to change for most people, but it's a reminder that's not your country. And if you want access to not only one other country, but in the case of Europe, an entire block of countries, residence and really citizenship is the way to do that. So let this be a reminder that not only can countries who have these systems be able to keep you out in the future by adding more questions, the same way the U.S. is now keeping people who visited a number of relatively benign countries for them out. And we've had clients, they visited some of those countries for business. They had to go to the U.S. Embassy and they had to get a visa, and there's no guarantee they would have gotten it. That was a restriction, in my view, on their visa-free travel. They've got a great travel document, and they have to go and beg to be able to get to the U.S. I see more countries are going to say, tit for tat, eye for an eye. If you're doing it to us, we're going to do it to you. And if you hold a non-European passport, you could be locked out of all these countries. Very, very low likelihood. I want to emphasize that. But what does the future hold? It shows you that in a time of increasing nationalism, increasing isolation from legacy brand countries, if you want options, you need to take steps to build those options. So let this be your reminder. If long-term access to Europe, whenever you want, for as long as you want, is something that's valuable, residence or citizenship does that. I'm just showing up as a tourist does it. Nomad Capitalist helps people figure out, do you need a residence permit? Do you need a citizenship? Do you need the combination thereof? What happens to your taxes? What if you have homes in 2 different countries? We recommend having homes in 2 different countries or more. You know, as you create a backup plan, as you create a plan for where to live in the summer, as you create a plan for, you know, where to go in the winter on your skiing trip, whatever it may be, having optionality beyond just being a tourist is good. That's what we help people figure out at Nomad Capitalist, and how to make that all work in one nice little bow. You can learn more at nomadcapitalist.com. So I'm not worried very much about ETIAS for 99% of you watching, but I do certainly think it portends for countries around the world greater restrictions in the future that you can protect yourself against by having diversification now.